It's strange how quickly the ordinary turns into the terrifying. One moment I was just sitting in history class, barely listening to Mr. Thompson's monotonous lecture on the Industrial Revolution, doodling in the margins of my notebook, and staring blankly at the clock, willing it to move faster. It was a normal Tuesday, and the final bell was only 10 minutes away. I was already mentally planning my escape, thinking about the snack I'd grab from the vending machine before heading home. Then it happened. A voice crackled over the school's PA system. At first it was just static, but then the principal's voice, usually calm and collected, broke through, laced with an edge of panic I had never heard before. Attention students and staff, this is a lockdown. I repeat, we are in lockdown. Please follow the protocols immediately. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, and move away from all windows. Do not leave the classrooms for any reason. Mr. Thompson froze mid-sentence, his face going pale. The usual groans of boredom from the class were replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. We had practiced lockdowns before, but they always seemed like a drill, a formality, just something the school had to do because it was part of the safety guidelines. But this didn't feel like a drill. The way the principal's voice quivered, it wasn't right. Mr. Thompson moved quickly, locking the classroom door, flipping the switch to turn off the lights, and pulling the blinds over the windows. His movements were jittery, rushed. He wasn't calm, and that only made my pulse race faster. "Everyone to the back of the room," he whispered, though the room was already deathly quiet. We shuffled our desks, moving towards the far corner, huddling in a tight cluster. My heart pounded in my chest, the kind of wild, erratic beating that makes you feel sick. I glanced at my classmates. Everyone was pale, eyes wide, and no one said a word. Even Jason, who was always cracking jokes no matter how serious the situation, sat silently, his leg bouncing nervously. Minutes passed, dragging out in an excruciating crawl. No one dared to even breathe too loudly. I clutched my phone in my hand, but when I tried to check for messages or updates, I found no service. It was strange. My phone never lost signal in the school. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like something scraping against the floor. My first thought was that maybe one of the janitors was out in the hallway, but that didn't make sense. No one should be outside during a lockdown. The sound grew louder, closer. It was deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy along the tiles. I felt a chill slither down my spine. I looked at Mr. Thompson, hoping he had some sort of explanation or reassurance, but his eyes were fixed on the door, his face a blank mask of fear. The scraping stopped, right outside our classroom. I could hear my own breath, shaky and shallow, and I fought the urge to gasp. The door handle rattled, just once, and then silence. No one moved. No one even dared to look at each other. We were all glued to the door, waiting, expecting something. I could feel my palms sweating, my back pressed uncomfortably against the cold cinder block wall. And then came the knock. 3 sharp, loud raps on the door, like someone impatient to be let in. We all flinched, even Mr. Thompson. He raised a finger to his lips, silently pleading for us to stay quiet. But I could see the terror in his eyes. He had no more control over the situation than we did. Whoever it was outside knocked again, but this time more violently, like they knew we were in here, like they wanted to be sure we heard them. My mind raced. This wasn't a teacher or security checking the classrooms. They wouldn't knock like that. They would have announced themselves. The scraping started again, moving further down the hall, fading away until there was nothing but silence once more. We stayed huddled together for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time had become a blur, a heavy fog of tension that wrapped around my chest and made it hard to breathe. I wanted to ask what was going on, but I didn't dare break the silence. I could feel the panic spreading through the room, thick and tangible. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, further down the hallway. It sounded like a door being thrown open. Someone screamed. It wasn't from our class, but the sound was unmistakable. A high, panicked shriek that echoed down the corridors. My blood turned to ice. "What's happening?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. I couldn't tell who had spoken. It didn't matter. We were all thinking the same thing. The banging continued, doors being thrown open violently, footsteps pounding through the hallways, followed by more screams. Closer this time. I glanced at the door, praying it would stay locked, that the flimsy wood and metal would somehow protect us from whatever was out there. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice before plunging us into complete darkness. A girl behind me stifled a sob. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was going to be okay. But I couldn't force the words out. I wasn't sure it was going to be okay. My own fear had rendered me mute, my throat tight, my thoughts racing too fast for me to grasp any of them. The only sound now was the faint hum of the emergency lights outside the room, and the occasional thud or scream from down the hall. Whatever was out there, it was moving closer. Hunting. I thought of my family, of my little sister waiting for me to pick her up after school. I thought of how I might never see them again. The thought hit me so hard it almost knocked the breath from my lungs. My grip tightened on my phone, though I knew it was useless. There was no signal, no way to call for help. A loud crash shattered the silence. The door to our classroom rattled, as if something had thrown itself against it. My heart jumped into my throat. The handle twisted again, this time more violently. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking anymore. They were trying to break in. I don't know how, but the door held. For a few more agonizing moments, it stayed locked despite the rattling, the banging, and the furious growl I thought I heard from the other side. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. We waited, too terrified to move. I stared at the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. But it didn't. The screams had stopped. The pounding footsteps had stopped. Everything had gone eerily still. I don't know how long we sat there huddled together in the dark. Minutes, hours. Time had lost all meaning. My body was numb, my mind racing with horrible possibilities. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the principal's voice crackled back over the PA system, though this time it was hoarse, barely above a whisper. All clear. Lockdown over. You may leave the classrooms. No one moved. No one trusted that voice. And in that moment I realized something that turned my blood cold. The voice on the PA. It didn't sound quite like the principal anymore. It was supposed to be a normal day. Just another Monday. The kind where your mind wanders through the hours, more focused on the clock than the lessons. I was in third period, biology, trying to stay awake while Mrs. Green droned on about ecosystems. My phone vibrated softly in my pocket, but I ignored it, hoping it wasn't my mom asking about my forgotten lunch again. Then, the intercom buzzed to life. The usual static crackled for a second, but this time it was followed by the vice principal's voice. Mr. Davis. His tone was unusually flat. Attention students and staff, we are now going into lockdown. This is not a drill. My head shot up immediately, and I wasn't the only one. You could feel the tension ripple through the room as everyone exchanged nervous glances. Lockdowns weren't common, and they were never spontaneous. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the anxiety building in my chest. Mrs. Green straightened up quickly. All right, class, you know the procedure. Everyone get to the back corner, away from the windows. Her voice was calm, but I could see the edge of fear in her eyes. We all stood, chairs scraping against the floor as we hurried to the back of the room. I huddled between the lab tables, crouching low as my classmates gathered around. The lights were still on, but Mrs. Green moved quickly to switch them off. The room fell into a dim, tense silence. I heard her lock the door, the click of the deadbolt sounding much louder in the quiet room. Then, She pulled the blinds down, blocking any view from outside. "Stay quiet," she whispered, crouching down near us. "We just need to wait until they say it's all clear." Wait. That was the plan. I glanced at the others. There was Michael, who sat behind me in class looking pale, and Jessica, who was gripping her phone like it was a lifeline. She was typing furiously, probably texting her parents. My heart was thudding in my chest, and I wanted to do the same, but my hands were shaking too much. I slipped my phone out of my pocket anyway, just to hold on to something. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. It was hard to tell in the silence. Everyone was holding their breath, listening for any sounds outside. My ears were tuned to every tiny creak and shuffle. The only thing we could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then there was a sound. A faint thud coming from the hallway. My breath caught. I saw Mrs. Green stiffen, her head tilting slightly as if she wasn't sure she heard it correctly. But then it came again, a soft, deliberate sound like footsteps. My skin prickled and I instinctively shrunk down lower. I stared at the door, my eyes fixed on the narrow sliver of glass in the window. The blinds didn't cover it completely. I wished they did. The footsteps were getting closer now, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking calmly through the hallway, searching. My imagination was running wild, but I forced myself to focus. Maybe it was just a janitor or a security guard, I told myself. Someone making sure everything was locked up tight. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside our door. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. We all stayed perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. A shadow passed in front of the glass. Someone was there. I could see the shape of them, just standing there, barely moving. My stomach twisted into knots, and I felt a bead of sweat run down the side of my face. Mrs. Green's hand was on the floor beside me, and I saw her fingers curl into a tight fist. The door handle moved. It turned slowly, the metal clicking softly as it rattled against the lock. My whole body tensed, expecting the worst. Was it a shooter? Someone dangerous? Why hadn't we heard any commotion? 1,000 thoughts raced through my head, each one worse than the last. The handle stopped moving. Then, the shadow disappeared from the window, as if whoever it was had decided to move on. I didn't relax. I couldn't. No one in the room did. We waited, every second feeling like an hour, straining to hear if the person was still out there. There were no more footsteps, no more sounds. But the silence only made the tension worse. Suddenly, my phone vibrated again, making me jump. The noise was almost deafening in the quiet. I fumbled with it, trying to silence it, but when I glanced at the screen, I saw the text. Mom called and asked, "Are you okay? I heard something's happening at the school. Police are on the way. Lock all doors." My breath hitched. Police? The situation was serious then. This wasn't just a precaution. I glanced at Mrs. Green, who had her phone in her hand now too. She was reading something, her face tight with worry. "Stay calm," she mouthed, barely a whisper. But her eyes betrayed her fear. Minutes stretched on, and the longer we waited, the worse the feeling in my gut became. I couldn't shake the thought that something horrible was happening outside these walls, just beyond that door. The kind of things you see on the news, the kind of things that ruin lives. And then, a sound. Not from the hallway, but from the far side of the classroom. A faint scraping noise. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned my head toward the back of the room, toward the storage closet. The door was slightly ajar. I couldn't see inside, but I could swear I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Jessica, sitting next to me, had her eyes wide, staring at the closet too. Mrs. Green followed our gaze, her face going even paler. Was someone in there? Another faint rustling noise came from the closet, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. No one moved. No one dared. Then, just as quietly as the sounds had come, the closet door creaked open a little wider. In the darkness, something shifted, a shadow moving, a figure. My breath caught in my throat, and I saw Mrs. Green's hand tremble as she slowly stood, motioning for us to stay where we were. She moved toward the closet, her steps slow, deliberate. The room was so still, it felt like the walls were closing in. The rest of us huddled together, frozen in terror, watching as she reached the door. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Just as Mrs. Green reached for the handle, the classroom door rattled again, the lock straining as someone outside tried the handle with more force this time. The loud noise shattered the silence, and Mrs. Green gasped, stepping back from the closet. There was no time to think, no time to process. The person outside the door banged on it, harder this time, and the sound echoed through the room like gunshots. The blinds rattled, and I felt the floor shake beneath me. Jessica started crying, her sobs muffled by her hands. The rest of us were frozen in place, fear gripping us like a vice. Mrs. Green rushed back toward us, her face a mask of fear. The banging stopped. For a moment, everything was still again. And then, through the quiet, the unmistakable sound of sirens cut through the air. It was over. I don't remember how long it took for the police to clear the building, or how we finally left the room. When they opened the door and told us it was safe, it felt like a dream, like I was floating through a fog of disbelief. Later, we found out what had happened. A man, someone with a history of violence, had walked into the school, armed, looking for someone. But he hadn't made it past the front office before the police arrived. He'd been caught trying to hide, and no one was hurt, not physically anyway. But I'll never forget the fear. The way the world seemed to stop in those moments when we were trapped, not knowing what was on the other side of the door, not knowing if we were going to make it out. Even now, the sound of footsteps in a hallway, the sight of a shadow moving past a window, it all brings me back to that day, back to the fear that still lingers long after the sirens faded into the distance. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, the kind where your mind is more focused on getting through the day than on anything happening around you. I was in math class, half-heartedly scribbling down notes as Mr. Avery went on about quadratic equations. The only thing keeping me going was the fact that lunch was just one period away. That's when the announcement came over the intercom. "Attention students and staff, this is Principal Ross. We are now going into immediate lockdown. This is not a drill. Please follow lockdown procedures." The tone in her voice froze the room. We all knew the usual lockdown drills, but the way she said, "not a drill," sent a shiver down my spine. People looked up from their notebooks, phones slipped into backpacks, and the once lazy hum of the room sharpened into tense silence. I glanced over at my friend Connor, sitting 2 seats to my left. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "What do you think's going on?" he mouthed, but I had no idea. Mr. Avery stood still for a moment, clearly shaken, before snapping into action. "Okay, everyone, move to the corner of the room, away from the windows, quietly." We scrambled from our desks, trying not to make any noise. I found myself pressed against the far wall, hidden between a row of bookshelves. Mr. Avery locked the door, double-checking it twice, and then pulled the blinds down over the windows. The lights clicked off, plunging the room into semi-darkness. We were all huddled together in the back, our bodies stiff, eyes darting around the room. No one spoke. No one dared. Time stretched on. The silence in the room was unbearable, the only sound the occasional cough or the nervous shifting of someone trying to get comfortable on the cold tile floor. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears, each thud making the tension worse. I pulled out my phone and checked it under the desk, careful to keep the screen dimmed. No new texts, no calls, nothing from my parents, nothing on the news. Everything felt too quiet, too still, like the calm before something bad happened. That's when the first sound came. It was faint at first, distant, like something far off in the hall. A dull thud, maybe a door closing, then another. The sounds were rhythmic, like someone moving methodically through the building. I held my breath, straining to listen. Thud, thud, thud. The noise grew closer, more deliberate. My stomach tightened as I realized it wasn't random. Whoever was walking, they were making their way toward us, toward this classroom. I glanced at Mr. Avery, who was crouched near the door, his eyes fixed on it like he was expecting it to burst open at any second. His face was pale, and I could see him shaking slightly as he motioned for us to stay completely silent. Even Connor, who never took anything seriously, was dead quiet, his eyes wide with fear. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, until they stopped directly outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. No one moved. We all stared at the door, willing it not to open. Then the handle turned. It was slow, so slow, like whoever was on the other side wanted us to hear them. The metal squeaked softly as the handle twisted, rattling against the lock. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. There was nowhere to go. The door didn't open. The lock held. But whoever it was didn't leave. Instead, they just waited. The shadow of their feet under the door was barely visible, but it was there. They weren't moving. Minutes passed, each one feeling like a lifetime. I could feel the tension rising in the room, everyone on edge, waiting for whatever was about to happen next. But the person outside the door just stood there, like they were listening, watching. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shadow shifted. The footsteps started again, slowly fading as the person walked away. The relief was immediate, but it didn't last. Not really. Something was wrong. Whoever had been there wasn't just passing through. They had been checking the doors, looking for something. Or someone. I looked at my phone again, desperate for some kind of update, but there was nothing. No one knew what was happening, and it felt like we were on our own. I could feel the fear radiating off the people around me, but no one dared say a word. Just as I thought we might have a moment to breathe, there was another sound. But this time, it wasn't from the hallway. It was coming from the air vents. I froze, my eyes darting toward the small grate in the ceiling near the front of the room. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of something moving through the ducts. Metal scraping, soft thumps. Whatever it was moving fast, and it was getting closer. Mr. Avery must have heard it too because he stood up slowly, his face twisted in confusion and fear. "Stay down," he whispered, but his voice shook. The sound in the vents grew louder, echoing through the room. I clenched my fists, my breath shallow as I stared at the ceiling, waiting. The scraping stopped directly above us, the vent cover rattling slightly as if something was pressing against it. I didn't want to imagine what could be inside. I couldn't, but my mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. The vent cover popped open with a soft metallic clang, and I saw something fall from it, a thin, black cable or wire. No, not a cable. It was moving, writhing. I swallowed, the scream building in my throat, my entire body tense with terror. Then something else came through. A hand. But it wasn't a normal hand. It was pale, the skin stretched tight over long, thin fingers, like something out of a nightmare. The hand gripped the edge of the vent, pulling at it, testing the weight. I felt my stomach drop, my legs shaking so hard I thought I might pass out. Whatever it was trying to crawl through the vent into the room. Mr. Avery backed up, his face twisted in horror. He grabbed a chair, holding it in front of him like a shield, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't know what to do. None of us did. The hand was followed by another, then a face. A pale, distorted face with eyes that were too big, too wide. It didn't make a sound as it slithered through the vent opening, its body long and twisted, moving in ways that no human should. Panic exploded in the room. Someone screamed. I couldn't tell who. We all scrambled back, trying to get away from it, but there was nowhere to go. The thing dropped from the ceiling, landing in the middle of the room with a sickening thud. Its eyes locked onto us, empty and hollow, like it was studying us. Then, the sound of breaking glass shattered the moment. The window in the door exploded inward, and I caught a glimpse of more figures outside. Figures dressed in tactical gear, weapons raised. The thing in the room didn't even flinch as the door was kicked open, and armed officers poured in, shouting commands. It moved faster than I thought possible, slithering toward the open vent like it was trying to escape. But one of the officers fired a shot, and the creature crumpled to the floor, its body twisting and twitching as it let out a low, gurgling sound before going still. The rest of the room was a blur of shouting and confusion as the officers cleared the area. We were pulled from the room one by one, ushered into the hallway where paramedics and police swarmed the school. I was still in shock, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. Later, when I was sitting outside on the curb, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, I overheard one of the officers talking to another. They didn't know what it was. They weren't even sure where it had come from. But whatever it wasn't supposed to be here. And even though it was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the only one. It started as a regular Tuesday afternoon, nothing out of the ordinary. The bell had just rung for fourth period and I was heading to English class, scrolling through my phone as I walked down the hall. There was the usual noise, kids talking, lockers slamming, that background hum of school life that you barely notice until it's gone. I was about halfway to my classroom when I heard the PA system crackle overhead. At first, it sounded like someone had pressed the button by accident, a garbled mess of static. But then Principal Wilkins' voice came through, strained and tense. "Attention, all students and staff. We are going into lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Secure yourselves in your classrooms immediately." For a second, I didn't react. My mind didn't want to believe it. But then I saw the looks on the faces of the kids around me, the sudden ripple of panic in the hall. People started moving fast, rushing toward whatever classroom was nearest. I glanced behind me. Mrs. Hart's history class was just a few doors back. I spun on my heel and darted toward it, my heart already pounding. I made it inside just as Mrs. Hart locked the door, the click of the lock far louder than it should have been. I wasn't alone. A few other kids had dashed in from the hallway as well, their faces pale and anxious. Mrs. Hart didn't say a word, just motioned for us to get down behind the desks. The lights were already off, the room eerily dim as she pulled the shades down over the windows. I crouched low, my back pressed against the wall, trying to get my breathing under control. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I yanked it out, my hands trembling. There was a text from my mom. My mom asked, "Are you okay? Just saw there's a lockdown at your school. Text me ASAP," she asked. I stared at the screen for a moment, trying to calm myself enough to reply. I wasn't okay, but I didn't want her to panic. My thumbs fumbled over the keys. "I'm fine," I replied, "in a classroom. Don't worry." It wasn't exactly true, but I needed her to believe it. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights. No one spoke. No one dared. We all just sat there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. I didn't know what was happening. No one did. But the uncertainty was suffocating. I could hear one of the girls near me, Haley, quietly crying, her sobs barely muffled by her hands. Another kid, Trevor, was gripping his phone so hard his knuckles were white. Everyone was glued to their phones, trying to figure out what was going on. But there was nothing. No updates, no news, just silence. Minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour. Then, just when I thought my nerves couldn't handle it anymore, I heard something. Footsteps. In the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. My stomach dropped. I glanced at Mrs. Hart, who was crouched behind her desk, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. They stopped right outside the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the handle rattled. My heart nearly stopped. I watched in horror as the handle twisted, but the lock held. Whoever it was on the other side gave it a firm push, testing the door. A wave of terror swept through the room. I could see Mrs. Hart's hand shaking as she pressed her finger to her lips, signaling for us to stay silent. The handle stopped moving. The footsteps resumed, this time moving farther down the hall. I didn't dare breathe. Neither did anyone else. The air in the room was thick with fear, every sound magnified, every second dragging on like an eternity. We sat there in silence, waiting, listening. For a while, all we could hear were those footsteps, echoing faintly in the distance. Then, nothing. After what felt like forever, my phone buzzed again, making me jump. It was another text from my mom. My mom then said, "They're saying the police are on the way. Lock your door and stay quiet." I couldn't bring myself to respond. My hands were shaking too much, and I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe it was almost over, that everything was going to be fine, but the tension in the room told me otherwise. Suddenly, from the other side of the school, there was a loud crash, like something heavy being thrown. A few people in the room flinched, but no one spoke. My heart was racing again, the fear clawing its way back to the surface. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. I heard faint sirens in the distance, getting closer, but they felt too far away. We were still sitting in the middle of it, trapped in this small room with no idea what was happening outside. Every creak of the building, every distant noise sent my nerves into overdrive. Then, finally, the PA system crackled again. But this time, the voice that came through wasn't Principal Wilkins. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. A man's voice, calm but firm. "Attention, this is Officer Ryan from the local police department. The building is secure. We are conducting a sweep, and we'll be coming to each classroom to clear it. Stay where you are, and do not open your doors until we arrive." A collective breath of relief swept through the room. I leaned back against the wall, my body shaking with the release of tension. Mrs. Hart finally let out a breath too, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. We weren't safe yet, but at least we weren't alone anymore. About 10 minutes later, we heard more footsteps, this time faster, more purposeful. The sound of police officers followed by a sharp knock on the door. "Police! We're clearing the room." Mrs. Hart quickly unlocked the door and a group of officers stepped inside, their presence immediately calming everyone down. They checked the room, then motioned for us to follow them out into the hallway. As we stepped into the hall, the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. The school was eerily quiet, and the tension in the air was still thick. We were escorted out in small groups, officers guiding us through the empty halls, past classrooms with other kids, just as scared as we had been. When we finally got outside, I saw the flashing lights of police cars, ambulances, and news vans. Parents were gathered at the far end of the lot, behind the police line, waiting anxiously. My mom was there, frantically scanning the crowd, and the moment she saw me, she ran over, wrapping me in the tightest hug I've ever felt. We found out later that a man had been spotted on campus with a weapon. He never made it far, though. The police had been called before anything could happen, and they caught him in one of the hallways near the front office. But in those long minutes before they arrived, we didn't know that. We had no idea what was going on, and the fear was all too real. It wasn't until I was home, safe in my room, that I let myself cry. The adrenaline had worn off, and all the emotions I'd been holding back came rushing out. That day felt like a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. And even now, weeks later, the sound of footsteps in a quiet hallway still sends a shiver down my spine. Because no matter how safe we think we are, I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped, waiting for something to happen, not knowing if I'd make it out. It was a Friday, and we'd all been waiting for the weekend, just one more day to get through before 2 days of freedom. I was in the cafeteria, sitting with my friends Rachel and Ethan, eating lunch and chatting about the movie we were planning to see that night. The noise level was the usual chaotic hum of hundreds of students talking, laughing, and shouting across tables. I was halfway through my sandwich when a loud, sharp sound cut through the room. The speakers overhead crackled to life, and our principal's voice filled the cafeteria. "Attention students and staff, this is a lockdown. I repeat, we are in lockdown. Please proceed with lockdown procedures immediately." The cafeteria fell silent. It took a second for everyone to register what was happening, and then the chaos began. I saw teachers spring into action, motioning for everyone to get down and move to the sides of the room. The large windows along the back wall were a huge problem in this situation, so the teachers directed us to get down low, away from the glass, and stay silent. I could feel the tension in the air as I crouched down with Rachel and Ethan. We pressed ourselves against the wall, our backs to the cold tile, knees pulled up to our chests. Rachel's eyes were wide with fear, and I could feel my own heart racing as I tried to process what was happening. We had gone through lockdown drills before, but they'd never felt like this. This was real. The cafeteria doors, usually swinging open as students came and went, were locked and barricaded by 2 staff members. They dragged tables in front of the doors, stacking chairs on top in a desperate attempt to secure them. The doors had small glass windows, and one of the teachers taped sheets of construction paper over them to block any view from the outside. Ethan was next to me, breathing heavily, his hands shaking. He whispered, "What do you think's happening? You think someone's in the school?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to say what I was thinking, and I didn't want to add to the fear that was already tightening my chest. Instead, I put a hand on his arm, trying to reassure him, and he gave me a weak, grateful smile. The minutes ticked by, and a thick, tense silence settled over the cafeteria. Everyone was crouched on the floor, huddled close to friends, trying to make themselves as small and invisible as possible. I glanced around and saw faces pale with fear, people looking like they were holding their breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. Then we heard footsteps in the hallway outside. They were heavy and slow, not like someone running, but more deliberate, like they were checking each door. The footsteps came closer and closer, and I could feel the terror building like it was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't dare move, barely even breathing, just staring straight ahead. The footsteps stopped right outside the cafeteria doors. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint rustling of clothes as people shifted nervously. My eyes were fixed on the barricaded doors, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Then there was a loud banging on the doors. Whoever was outside was trying to get in, rattling the handles, pushing against the barricade. I could feel the fear radiating from everyone around me like an invisible wave that was about to crash over us. I reached for Rachel's hand, squeezing it tightly, and she clung back, her fingers cold and trembling. One of the teachers, Ms. Grayson, stepped forward, her face set in a calm, determined expression. She whispered to us to stay quiet, giving us all a reassuring look before she positioned herself between us and the door. I felt a surge of respect for her, standing there, ready to protect us even though she looked just as terrified as the rest of us. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped and the footsteps moved on. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my entire body shaking with relief. But we stayed where we were, huddled in silence, too afraid to move, too afraid to hope that it might actually be over. Minutes turned into an hour, and I started to lose track of time. My legs were cramped, and my back ached from sitting against the hard wall. But I didn't care. I was too focused on listening, straining to hear any sound that might tell us what was happening. Finally, the speakers crackled on again, and Principal Robin's voice came through, sounding tired and shaken. "Attention, students and staff. The lockdown has been lifted. Please stay where you are. Police officers will come to your area to release you." A wave of relief washed over the room, and I could see people starting to relax, shoulders dropping, breaths coming easier. Some students started crying softly, the release of fear and tension finally overwhelming them. I felt my own eyes well up, but I quickly blinked back the tears. I didn't want to break down here, in front of everyone. About 10 minutes later, 2 police officers entered the cafeteria. They walked in slowly, scanning the room with serious expressions. One of them nodded to Ms. Grayson and she stood up, her face showing a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over, everyone," she said softly. "You're safe now." The officers escorted us out, guiding us through the halls, which were filled with other students and teachers, all looking as shaken as we were. I glanced around, taking in the familiar surroundings that suddenly felt strange and threatening. When we stepped outside, I saw a line of police cars, their lights flashing, and a small crowd of parents gathered at the edge of the school grounds waiting anxiously. I spotted my mom in the crowd, and as soon as she saw me, she ran over and wrapped me in a hug, holding me tight like she never wanted to let go. For the first time all day, I let myself cry, the fear and relief crashing over me like a tidal wave. She held me, stroking my hair, whispering that everything was okay now. I don't remember much of what happened after that. My mom drove me home and I just sat there in a daze, trying to process everything. It was over, but the fear lingered, like a shadow that I couldn't shake. The next day, the school was closed for emotional recovery, but I knew that even when we went back, things would never feel the same. It was a regular Wednesday morning at Jefferson High. I remember it was second period and I was in Mr. Carver's history class. We'd just started covering the events that led up to World War II, and I was trying to keep my eyes open as he droned on about the Treaty of Versailles. The hum of his voice was soothing in a way, almost lulling me into a half-asleep state, when a crackling sound filled the room. The PA system clicked on. It was Principal Robbins, and her voice sounded different. "Attention teachers and students, we are now in lockdown. This is not a drill, I repeat, we are in lockdown. Please follow lockdown procedures immediately." The room went from sleepy to dead silent in seconds. Mr. Carver froze mid-sentence, his face turning an odd shade of pale. No one moved at first, like we were all processing the words at our own pace. Then he snapped into action, motioning for us to get up quickly, but quietly. He didn't need to say anything, everyone knew what to do. We'd practiced lockdown drills before, but it had always been just that, a drill. This was different. You could feel it in the air. I shuffled toward the corner of the room with everyone else, heart pounding, and settled down on the floor. Mr. Carver locked the door, pulled down the blinds on the windows, and switched off the lights, plunging us into a tense semi-darkness. He joined us in the corner, crouching down and whispering, "Stay quiet. No phones. Keep your electronics on silent." His voice was calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I was sitting cross-legged, wedged between my friend Emily and a freshman I barely knew, but we all pressed together, feeling a bit safer huddled close. I could feel Emily's hand shaking next to mine, and I gave her a quick, reassuring squeeze. She tried to smile, but ended up looking even more terrified. No one spoke. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I found myself listening to my own breath, forcing myself to breathe quietly, steadily, even though my heart felt like it was about to explode. Minutes stretched on like hours. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the seconds tick by painfully slowly. My mind started to wander, imagining all kinds of scenarios. Was there someone dangerous in the school? Was everyone else safe? I thought about my brother, a sophomore in a different wing of the school. I wanted to check on him, but I didn't dare take out my phone. I knew my parents would be worried too if they'd heard anything, but I tried to push that thought aside. Then from somewhere down the hall we heard a dull thud. It wasn't loud, but in the eerie silence of the classroom, it sounded like a cannon. Someone next to me gasped, and I bit down on my lip to keep myself from making any noise. Mr. Carver held up a finger to his lips, his expression tense, reminding us to stay quiet. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone banging on a locker or a door. My imagination was running wild. Was someone trying to get in? Was it an intruder? I could feel Emily trembling beside me, and I wished there was something I could do to make us both feel better. But we were all helpless, stuck there, waiting. Another noise echoed down the hallway, louder, sharper. I couldn't tell if it was a door slamming or something worse, but every sound seemed to carry a new wave of dread. I tried to tune it out, counting my breaths, focusing on the things I could control. In and out, in and out. After what felt like forever, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. They were slow, methodical, as if whoever was out there was moving with purpose. My heart rate spiked, and I could feel the tension in the room shift. Everyone on edge, holding their breath. I could see the outline of Mr. Carver's face in the dim light, his jaw clenched, his shoulders tense. He seemed ready to act if he needed to, but what could any of us do? The footsteps stopped right outside our door. I swear my heart nearly stopped. Someone tried the handle, jiggling it forcefully, and for a split second, I thought they might get in. My body went rigid, and I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to disappear. After a few agonizing moments, the handle stopped moving. The footsteps resumed, fading down the hallway, leaving us in silence once again. We waited there in the darkness, our breaths shallow and strained as the minutes dragged on. My legs were starting to cramp, but I didn't dare move. No one did. The quiet felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on us. I wanted to check the time, to do anything to distract myself, but every movement felt like a risk. The only thing we could do was sit, listen, and hope it would all be over soon. Finally, after what must have been at least an hour, though it felt so much longer, the intercom crackled back on. This time the voice sounded tired, relieved. Attention, students and staff. The lockdown has been lifted. Police officers will be coming to each room to escort you out. Please remain in your classrooms until an officer arrives. A collective sigh of relief went through the room, but no one dared stand up yet. We stayed huddled in the corner, waiting for Mr. Carver to give us the okay. He still looked shaken, but he managed a small smile and told us, "Just a little longer, everyone." Not long after, 2 officers came to our door. They knocked gently, then opened it, peeking inside. One of them nodded reassuringly, gesturing for us to stand up. The walk out of the classroom felt surreal, like emerging from a nightmare. The hallway was filled with teachers and students, all looking dazed and relieved, some even crying. Police officers lined the halls, guiding us toward the exits, making sure everyone was safe. I spotted my brother with his friends down the hall, and we made eye contact, both of us looking worn out but thankful. When we finally got outside, I felt the cool air hit my face, and it was like I could breathe again. I looked back at the school, watching the flashing lights of the police cars reflecting off the windows, trying to process everything that had happened. Standing there with my friends, I realized how grateful I was for all of them, even for Mr. Carver, who had kept us safe. We didn't say much to each other. There wasn't really anything to say. But we all knew that we'd remember that day for a long, long time. The bell had just rung for 4th period, and I was rushing down the hall to get to English class. I was already late, thanks to forgetting my homework in my locker. My school isn't huge, but during passing periods, it feels like a mob scene, with everyone packed tight shouting over each other, the sound of lockers slamming. I was weaving through the crowd, squeezing past people, almost at my classroom door when the loudspeaker crackled. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then our principal's voice came on, strained and hurried. "Attention, students and staff. We are in lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." A strange hush fell over the hallway as everyone processed her words. It felt like the world had stopped moving for a second, and then the chaos erupted. Teachers stepped out of their classrooms, frantically waving students inside. The few stragglers in the hallway, me included, were rushed inside the nearest door by whatever teacher was closest. I was herded into Mr. Keating's chemistry room with a handful of other kids I didn't know well, all of us exchanging panicked looks. Mr. Keating moved fast, locking the door, switching off the lights and gesturing for us to huddle in the back corner behind his lab tables. "Phones off, stay low, and stay silent," he whispered, a command that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Something about his voice told me he was as scared as we were, even if he was trying to keep it together. The classroom was dark and quiet, except for the muffled breathing around me. I pressed my back against the cold tile wall, pulling my knees up and hugging them to my chest. My heart was racing so fast I could feel it in my throat. I had the sudden urge to check my phone, to text my mom, to tell her I was okay, but I knew I couldn't risk it. The school had drilled it into us. No sound, no movement. Minutes ticked by in tense, stifling silence. I could feel every twitch and shuffle from the kids huddled next to me, and the air felt thick and close. I focused on keeping my breathing steady, counting each inhale and exhale, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Who was out there? What was happening? Then we heard a loud bang from somewhere down the hallway, followed by a faint shout. It was impossible to tell how far away it was, but it sent a ripple of terror through the room. Someone near me let out a choked gasp, and Mr. Keating immediately held up a finger to his lips, his eyes pleading for silence. The banging continued, getting louder, moving closer, punctuated by short bursts of shouting. Every sound echoed through the empty halls, making it impossible to tell which direction it was coming from. My pulse was thundering in my ears, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I glanced around, catching the wide-eyed looks on the faces of the kids around me. I didn't know any of them well, but in that moment, we were all sharing the same fear, the same helplessness. Just when I thought I couldn't handle the tension any longer, we heard footsteps, heavy, purposeful footsteps echoing down the hallway, coming closer and closer. My entire body went rigid. The footsteps stopped right outside our door, and I held my breath, heart hammering so hard it hurt. Whoever was out there jiggled the handle, testing the lock. It made a metallic clanking sound that felt like nails down my spine. Someone next to me started trembling, and I reached over instinctively, grabbing their hand, holding on tight as we both braced ourselves. The handle stopped moving, but the person outside didn't leave. I could hear breathing, heavy, deliberate breathing, just on the other side of the door. I didn't dare look up, but I could feel everyone else was doing the same thing, staring at the door, willing it to stay closed. Mr. Keating was crouched beside us, his body angled in front of ours, like he was ready to shield us if he had to. The silence stretched, hanging over us like a blade. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps moved on, fading down the hallway. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling as relief mixed with lingering fear. I didn't let go of the person's hand next to me, and they didn't let go of mine. We sat there, frozen in the darkness, long after the footsteps faded. Time was meaningless, reduced to the relentless thudding of my heart and the occasional creak of the building settling. I started counting again, anything to keep myself from spiraling into panic. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention, everyone. The lockdown is lifted. Remain in your classrooms. Police officers will be coming around to release you." The relief that washed over the room was almost palpable. People around me slumped against the walls, letting out sighs of relief, some of them quietly crying. I realized I'd been holding my breath for so long that my chest hurt. Mr. Keating gave us a reassuring nod, though I could tell he was just as shaken as we were. About 10 minutes later, a police officer knocked on the door, identifying himself before Mr. Keating let him in. The officer looked around, giving us all a nod, and told us everything was under control. We stood up slowly, stretching stiff legs and shaking out numb arms. The walk out of the classroom felt surreal, like stepping back into reality after a nightmare. As I walked down the hallway, I saw my friend Chloe, and we fell into each other's arms, clinging on tight. Neither of us said a word, just held each other, taking comfort in the fact that we were both okay. I don't remember much about the rest of the day. My mom picked me up, and I just sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window in a daze. Everything felt different, like the world had shifted and couldn't shift back. The lockdown was over, but a part of me knew that things wouldn't ever be the same. It was supposed to be a normal Saturday at the mall. My friends and I had been looking forward to this day all week. We'd planned to hit up a few stores, grab something to eat, and maybe catch a movie if there was time. It was just me, Carla, and James, doing what we always did when we wanted to unwind. We were in our third store of the day, a small clothing boutique on the upper floor. Carla was holding up a sweater, debating if she wanted to buy it, when we heard a loud pop. It was faint at first, blending in with the general hum of shoppers, but then it happened again. Another pop, louder, sharper. People started looking around, their faces filled with confusion and a creeping sense of alarm. James glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. "What was that?" he whispered. I shrugged, trying to brush it off, but I could feel the nervous energy around us. Then came the scream. It echoed through the mall, raw and piercing, cutting through the chatter and the soft background music. People around us froze, the same look of dread spreading from face to face. The next moment, another scream, and this time, it was followed by a chaotic stampede of people rushing down the escalators, sprinting past stores, pushing and shoving each other in a desperate attempt to get away from something. Before we could process what was happening, a voice came over the loudspeaker. It was shaky, clearly trying to stay calm. "Attention shoppers, we are in lockdown. Please find the nearest secure area and remain inside. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." Everything went silent for a second, like the entire mall was holding its breath. Then pandemonium broke loose. Shoppers were screaming, running in every direction, and I could feel the adrenaline surge through me, instinctively pulling Carla and James toward the back of the store, away from the main corridor. The employees were locking the front doors, but the glass walls didn't feel like they'd keep us safe if anything happened. One of the employees pointed us to a back room, a storage area filled with boxes and clothing racks. There were about a dozen other people crammed in with us. Strangers, employees, families, all huddled together, eyes wide with fear. The door clicked shut, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening, a silent understanding that we had to stay absolutely quiet. Carla clutched my hand so tightly it hurt, and I could feel her whole body shaking. James was beside us, his face pale, lips pressed tightly together. No one said a word. The only sound was the occasional muffled sob from a child in the corner, being soothed by their parent. Time dragged on in that small room, the silence broken only by the faint sounds of chaos outside. I kept straining to listen, my heart racing with every distant noise. At one point, we heard footsteps, heavy, hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor outside the store. Someone was shouting, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I held my breath, my hand clammy in Carla's grasp, and I saw James close his eyes, as if willing himself to disappear. The footsteps grew louder, then faded, moving farther down the corridor. But the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. I could feel my own heartbeat, pounding so loudly that it seemed to echo through my whole body. We were trapped, helpless, hiding in the back of a clothing store, not knowing what was going on outside, not knowing if we were safe. More minutes ticked by, though it felt like hours. The air in the room was stifling, and I could feel the weight of everyone's fear pressing down on me. My mind raced, thinking of every possible scenario, every reason that this lockdown might end badly. Finally, the loudspeaker crackled to life again, the voice even shakier this time. "Attention shoppers, the lockdown is still in effect. Please stay where you are. Law enforcement is sweeping the building." That announcement didn't exactly calm anyone down. I could see the looks of terror around the room. People clutching each other, holding on to anything that made them feel even a little bit safe. James was gripping my shoulder now, and I could feel his fingers digging in, but I didn't mind. In that moment, we all needed each other. Then we heard a new noise, a heavy thud against the main glass doors of the store. Everyone froze, all eyes darting to the door of the storage room, as if expecting it to burst open at any second. The thud came again, louder this time, and I could feel my pulse spike. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could be anywhere but here. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. Dead quiet. No footsteps, no thuds, nothing but the shallow breathing of the people around me. I opened my eyes, barely daring to believe it might be over. A few minutes later, we heard the muffled voices of officers outside. There was a knock on the storage room door, and everyone held their breath until we heard a calm, steady voice on the other side. "This is the police. You're safe. We're here to get you out." The wave of relief that washed over the room was overwhelming. People started crying, hugging, some even laughing in disbelief. We were escorted out in small groups, and when we stepped back into the main corridor, I felt like I was seeing the mall for the first time. It was empty, eerily silent, a stark contrast to the usual hustle and bustle. Police officers were everywhere, directing people, checking in on us. Outside, I saw a line of squad cars, the flashing lights casting a surreal glow over everything. My mom was standing near the barricade, and as soon as she saw me, she ran over, pulling me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. She didn't let go for a long time, and I didn't want her to. As we drove home, the reality of what had happened started to sink in. The mall, a place I'd always associated with fun, friends, normality, felt tainted, marked by fear. Even though we were safe, I knew I'd never look at it the same way again. I still don't know what came over me to accept the dare. Maybe I just wanted to prove I wasn't afraid. But the idea of breaking into the mall during the lockdown, spending an hour there alone, seemed easy enough when my friends threw down the bet. I hopped the fence around midnight, flashlight in hand, careful not to set off any alarms. It was eerie right away. The mall, usually so loud and bright, was dead quiet. The main atrium was a shadow of itself, the big skylights barely letting in any moonlight, leaving most of the space in a dim, blue-gray gloom. The air felt strange, stale, as if it hadn't moved in weeks. I took a few steps, the sound of my own shoes on the tile too loud, echoing back at me from somewhere down the empty corridors. I'd never been here alone before. No one had, probably. Malls were meant to be busy, packed with shoppers, kids, and families. But now it was just me, and a whole lot of darkness. I kept walking, trying to look around and take in the sights I normally ignored. The shuttered storefronts, the signs with mannequins frozen in poses that seemed almost too lifelike in the shadows. As I passed a sports store, I saw a mannequin wearing a jersey and ball cap posed like it was about to throw a basketball. I laughed to myself, nervous. A little creepy, sure, but not enough to scare me. Then came the sound. It was faint, like something scraping across the tile. I froze, holding my breath. I waited, listening for any follow-up noise, but nothing happened. I shook my head, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, it's an old building, probably just the air ducts settling or something. I kept moving, but the feeling stuck with me. There was something unsettling about the silence. It wasn't just that it was quiet. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, made every little noise sound like a gunshot. I was maybe halfway down the hall when I heard it again, louder this time. A scraping, shuffling sound, definitely not coming from me. My heart started to pick up, and I clicked on my flashlight, shining it down the corridor. It landed on a door I hadn't noticed before, one of those authorized personnel-only doors, slightly ajar. The kind of door you'd imagine janitors or mall security might slip in and out of, the kind you don't even glance at when the mall's open. But it wasn't just ajar. It looked like it had been forced open. The lock was broken, hanging from the doorframe. I took a step closer, my brain screaming at me to stop, but my curiosity pushing me forward. If there was someone else here, maybe a security guard or some other thrill seeker like me, I wanted to find out. I peered into the narrow gap, shining my light down the short hallway. There was no one there. Just a hallway lined with boxes and cleaning supplies leading to the back rooms. And then I heard the sound again. Closer, from just around the corner. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. My own voice felt weird in the emptiness, and I almost laughed at myself. But that's when I saw it. A shadow moving along the wall, quick and low, like someone trying to stay out of sight. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call my friends and tell them to come get me. But the screen was a harsh blue glow in the darkness, and I didn't want to risk giving away my position. I looked up, shining my flashlight again, but the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty. The sensible thing would have been to leave. Just turn around, walk right back out the way I came, and forget about the whole thing. But something about that shadow, it wasn't the size of a person. It looked too small, too fast. And when I looked closer, I noticed something strange on the floor. It was a smear of something dark and sticky, trailing from the open door to the far end of the hallway. I shone my light over it, realizing with a sinking feeling that it looked a lot like blood. I backed away, heart racing, convinced I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have. Maybe there were squatters here, people hiding out in the mall during lockdown. But blood? That felt like more than I'd bargained for. I turned and started walking back down the corridor, faster now, my shoes slapping against the tile in a rhythm that was suddenly way too loud. And then I heard it again. Footsteps this time, echoing from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. I just started running. I ran through the dark hallways, ducking past the mannequins and closed storefronts, my flashlight bobbing in front of me. My footsteps echoed like gunfire, and I swore I could hear someone else behind me, keeping pace. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. Just darkness and empty corridors, silent mannequins posed in unsettlingly lifelike ways. I burst out into the main atrium, gasping, feeling a surge of relief at the wide-open space. I was only a few yards from the exit when I saw it. Another shadow, this one standing still, right at the main entrance. It looked like a person, but wrong somehow. The way it stood, almost too still. Its head tilted at a strange angle, like it was listening, watching. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. But then the shadow moved, slowly, one step at a time, blocking my path to the exit. I was trapped. "Hey," I shouted, desperate now. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm leaving. I'm just leaving, okay?" No response. The shadow just kept coming closer, one slow, deliberate step at a time. I felt my throat tighten, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I didn't know where to go. Then, just as the shadow reached the edge of my flashlight beam, it stopped. I squinted, heart racing, and suddenly realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a mannequin, pushed out from one of the stores, posed in a way that made it look like it was walking toward me. And behind it, just barely visible in the dim light, I saw movement. Someone, or something, was pulling the mannequin forward, dragging it, using it like a puppet. That was it. I bolted. I tore down the hallway, not even caring where I was going. I just needed to get as far from that thing as possible. My flashlight caught flashes of storefronts, more mannequins, more shadows. But I didn't stop until I found a side exit. I yanked on the door, relief flooding over me as it opened, and stumbled outside into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block, my heart hammering, lungs burning, too afraid to look back. I never told my friends what happened in the mall that night. I just told them I'd chickened out, that they were right, and that I wasn't as brave as I thought. But every now and then, I think back to that mannequin, posed at the entrance, and the figure hiding in the shadows behind it. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that mall that night, it was waiting for me to come back.